Okay, hello and welcome to Semantics II, Part 2. We have 3 great talks lined up. Each of the 3 authors will have 20 minutes to present, followed by 10 minutes for questions. And questions can be put either in the Q&A or in the chat. And we'll answer them during the question period. Our first speaker will be Esther Ototkovac from Cornell University, who will be speaking about double evidential morphology, dubitative or evaluative.
Yes, thank you.
Esther, you can go ahead and share slides if you have them.
Yes.
Great.
Let me quickly. So hopefully you can see my screen. Okay. So then let me start. So the topic of the investigation is going to be Turkish and Bulgarian double evidentials, which sometimes people refer to dubitatives. And these express a lack of speaker commitment to the scope proposition. And the overarching question I'm asking is that, can we find some cross-linguistically robust similarities between these structures, such as we can find some cross-linguistically very robust common features for evidentials, for instance. So let's get started. A central concept for evidentiality is speaker commitment. In certain types of indirect evidentials, such as reportative evidentials, the speaker does not have to be committed to the truth of the scope proposition. So a simple example is given in one, which is a Turkish example. Tavuklardan birini tilki boğmuş. And in this evidential sentence, the speaker may not be committed to the truth of this proposition. That is, this sentence can be followed up by saying, I don't believe this, or this is not true. This is only a property of indirect evidentials. Direct evidentials have to be true from the speaker's perspective. That is, the speaker has to be committed to the truth of the proposition. Some languages have intonational methods to express that the speaker is not committed to the truth of the scope proposition. Other languages may have some sort of morphosyntactic ways to express the same thing. And Turkish and Bulgarian are such languages. And as you'll see on the next page, they do this by sort of doubling the evidential morpheme, so they can express this lack of speaker commitment. Just a short note on terminology. So these constructions are called dubitatives in Bulgarian, and I'll argue that these are some sort of evaluatives in Turkish. Okay, but these essentially refer to double evidentials. So two illustrative examples are given in 2 and 3. So the Turkish example in 2, tavuklardan birini tilki boğmuşmuş, expresses that I do not, the speaker does not trust the source of evidence, and the sentence cannot be followed up with something like, I believe this, at least in this context, but later I show that in fact this sentence is compatible with speaker commitment. In contrast, the Bulgarian sentence can never be followed up by, I believe this. So the speaker has to believe that this proposition is false. So as I said, I'm going to compare Bulgarian and Turkish. The Bulgarian data will mainly come from just published sources and some elicited data from a native speaker. And I'll mainly talk about the Turkish data and how it's different from the Bulgarian dubitative constructions. But I'll, in the end, establish that there is one common feature that these two constructions potentially share, and that's that they both introduce a new indexical element that I'll call evaluator. So the data, as I said, the Bulgarian data mostly comes from published sources, and the Turkish data comes from elicitations from 6 native speakers. And a caveat here, so out of the 6, only 4 accepts these double evidential forms. 2 of them, for some reason, either they don't have it in their grammar, or it could be some sort of prescriptive judgment. I think I leave this for further research to establish what's really going on with these 2 speakers, or that potential variety. So I'm not going to have a lot of time to go into the Bulgarian data, but one thing that I would like to emphasize, that the Bulgarian dubitative sentences, such as S3, always express that the speaker is committed, that the scope proposition is false. That is, there is never speaker commitment towards the proposition. And oops. And this said, I would like to move on to the Turkish, what I call evaluatives. So some general description of the Turkish evaluatives. So first of all, these are not compatible with direct evidentials, that is shown in 5. They are not compatible with inferential evidentials, which is illustrated in 6. So that is, I could not.
Esther, your slides aren't advancing.
Interesting.
I don't know if your screen may be frozen.
I can, for me, they, let me do it again, maybe.
Yeah, maybe restart the screen
Yeah.
share.
Can you see it now?
Yes. Try scrolling.
Does it work?
So it doesn't scroll.
Interesting, it worked, I tried it. Let me just, do you see the scrolling now?
No.
Interesting, I'm sorry. Let me just then, so this is.
There it goes. Now we're seeing it.
Yeah, I'm sorry then, I cannot do this in the full screen view. I'm so sorry. So could people see the second page?
No, so we haven't seen this.
You haven't seen the second page. Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know, should I go over it again or?
Yeah, why don't.
All right.
That would be good.
Yeah, okay. I'm so sorry. So hopefully you can see it. And so 2 and 3, again, were just 2 illustrative examples of the Turkish and Bulgarian examples. And so the Turkish sentence is tavuklardan birini tilki boğmuşmuş. And again, this expresses that a fox killed a chicken. I heard, but I don't believe it. And we were saying that it seems like the speaker is really not committed to the truth of this proposition. And we can find similar examples in Bulgarian. And well, the rest, I guess, was probably followable. Yeah. And so we moved on to the Turkish evaluatives. And again, like I was saying, that the Turkish evaluative is not compatible with direct evidentials, that's shown at 5. So tavuklardan birini tilki boğduymuş is ungrammatical. And also Turkish, the evaluative mish is not compatible with inferential, which is shown in 6. So tavuklardan birini tilki boğmuşmuş could not mean that a fox killed one of the chickens. I inferred, but I don't believe it. So that's not available. The only possible context where the evaluative can be used is with reportative evidentials, which was example 2, which will be repeated here. So these Turkish evaluatives cannot be uttered in out of the blue contexts, which is illustrated in 7. This contrasts with regular evidentials such as 8, which are totally fine in out of the blue context. Importantly, these evaluatives need a context where the source is spelled out explicitly, or it's in the common ground. So the source has to be in the common ground. This is very important for the evaluatives. And there has not been a lot of work on these Turkish evaluatives, but a notable work is Nilüfer Şener's dissertation, which devotes a chapter to these constructions. And she argues that these double mesh construction is the result of reduplication, and this reduplication essentially intensifies the lack of commitment to the scope proposition. And there are several pieces of evidence against such a view. And there are morphosyntactic and semantic pieces of evidence that we can mention. I'm not gonna go over them in detail, but an important morphosyntactic evidence, I think, which is I think is pretty strong, that I would like to mention, is that there could be intervening suffixes between the two mishes in Turkish. So, for example, hakaret etmişimmiş, you can see that an agreement suffix, so a suffix can intervene between the two mish, indicating that this cannot be a case of reduplication. And there are other morphosyntactic pieces of evidence. And very importantly, there is this important semantic evidence that these constructions do not necessarily express lack of speaker commitment, illustrated by the fact that these sentences could be followed up by "I believe this." And this is shown in example 10a for Turkish. So I call these contexts third-hand evidence contexts. So this is a context where I go out and find my chicken dad, and then I talk to the neighbor, and this neighbor, let's call her Zeynep, and she tells me that she heard from another neighbor, Murat, that the chicken was killed by a fox. And then I go and tell someone else that I talked to the neighbor, tavuklardan birini bir tilki boğmuşmuş, which in this case means something like a fox killed one of the chickens. I heard from someone who heard it from someone else. And in this context, the speaker could be committed to the truth of this proposition, illustrated by the fact that I believe this. I believe this follow-up sentence is felicitous. And importantly, this is not possible for Bulgarian. So clearly, Turkish does something differently than Bulgarian. And so I've just repeated the two contexts here in 11 and 12. So just to reiterate, in 11, I had this context where I the speaker, I had indirect evidence, but I find this not trustworthy. So this is one context. I could use double mesh, and the other context was this third-hand evidence context. So I heard from someone who heard from someone else. And note the distinction between the commitment here. What I would like to argue is that these are not two separate constructions. These are the very same constructions, and we can propose a unified analysis for them. So crucially, these two constructions are not combinable, that is, they cannot co-occur. So I could not say something like, I have third-hand information for this co-proposition, but I don't believe this. This is attempted in 13, which you can see like would be something like a triple mesh construction. So tavuklardan birini teki boğmuş muş muş. Boğmuş muş muş. So this is ungrammatical. And this is not the reason why this is not possible is not because the triple mesh construction is somehow disallowed for some morphosyntactic reason. In fact, we can find these triple mesh constructions, which is one is given in 14. And this is a naturally occurring example from a newspaper column. And so the Turkish example is casusluk yapmamışlar olsalar bile bir casusluk yapmışlarmış. So this means that even if they didn't do espionage, they did some sort of espionage. I hear, but I don't believe this. This is ridiculous. But crucially, this can never mean I heard from someone who heard from someone else that the proposition, but I don't believe it. So this meaning is just unavailable for these sort of sentences. And I consider these triple mesh constructions actually a case of true reduplication, where the evaluative morpheme is reduplicated. So if these two sentences in 11 and 12 are in fact the same, then how can we propose a unified analysis for them? Oops, yeah, I forgot that. This is a different view. Okay, so I'm going to invoke this long-standing view that there is some sort of correlation between speaker commitment and sourcehood. So we can envision sourcehood on a scale where there could be the direct evidence would be on the strong end of the scale. This if I have perceptual evidence that's somehow a good strong source, and other types of evidence could be envisioned as weaker types of evidence. And these would correlate with speaker commitment. And what I would like to put forth here is that hearsay that is information coming from a not trusted source and uninvolved dependent sources, which are sources that don't have direct evidence and are not committed to the truth of the whole proposition, are weak sources. And what this second mesh, this evaluative mesh in Turkish would do is essentially just assert that the source for this evidential proposition is not a strong one. So it evaluates essentially the strength of the source. It doesn't say anything about whether the proposition is true or false, which I claim the Bulgarian does. So what is this Turkish mesh, evaluative mesh? Something that presupposes that the evidence holder has this source of evidence Z, and then it asserts that in the evaluator's point of view, this source Z is not a strong evidence, a strong source for its whole proposition. And so I introduce here this concept evaluator, which seems to be, I think, a new discovery that comes out of this study. And I'd like to look at questions to show you that this is in fact different from the evidence holder. So we're gonna, in the remaining time, look at some questions. So just to give you a little context, both Turkish and Bulgarian have interrogative flip, which it means that in questions, the evidence holder shifts from the speaker to the addressee. So in assertions, the evidence holder is the speakers, but in questions, the evidence holder shifts to the addressee. This is illustrated in 15 with the Turkish example. So in Turkish question, if you put in simple evidential question, it means according to your indirect source, what is key? When is the school getting reopened? So if the evidence holder is the same as the evaluator, we would predict that in questions, the evidence holder and the evaluator both would need to shift to the addressee. But as you'll see, this is not what we get. So this would be the case of 16. This is a little bit complicated context, but it essentially sets up a situation where the addressee will have indirect evidence and the addressee would have doubts or would have an evaluation on the source. So if I have a question, okul ne zaman açılacakmışmış? It could not possibly mean according to your source that you deem unreliable. When is the school getting reopened? That is, this is the context where both the evidential origo and the evaluator shift to the addressee. In fact, instead what we get in 17 is that the evaluator remains the speaker, but the evidential origo shifts to the addressee. So okul ne zaman açılacakmışmış? In different context, it means according to your source, that I, the speaker, deem unreliable. When is the school getting reopened? So again, just to show this quickly. So the speaker is the evaluator, but the evidence holder shifts to the addressee. Turkish. And I think I'm not going to have a lot of time to show this for Bulgarian, but I have to set up context a little bit differently for Bulgarian. But what I found is that this is the same for Bulgarian. So the evidence holder and the evaluator has to shift differently in questions. That is, the evidence holder will be the addressee and the evaluator will remain the speaker, which will be illustrated in example 18. So we can conclude that both Bulgarian and Turkish, these dubitative evaluative constructions introduce this evaluator. And so what comes out of this investigation of this double evidential construction is that we see that the Bulgarian and Turkish dubitatives or evaluatives have different meanings, slightly different meanings, but the one property they seem to share is that they introduce this new indexical element to structure, which I call the evaluator. And thank you. I hope I did not run over time too much.
All right. Thank you so much for that talk.
Thanks.
We have about 7 minutes for questions. So audience members can either put questions in the Q&A or the chat, or you can also raise your hand and ask them directly. So maybe I'll start. I thought this was very interesting. And since you discuss the evaluator as an indexical element, I was wondering what happens in embedded environments where we also might expect that an element like that could shift.
Yeah. So I investigated that for Turkish, and the judgments were somewhat less clear, but so just to a little background on Turkish, so evidentials, in embedded environments, they can shift and or not. So both are possible. So when I say something like, a fox killed the chicken, evidential, Murat said, it could either mean that either the speaker could have indirect evidence or Murat. So both are possible in a simple evidential. And what I got, and again, the data is less clear, but it seems like both are available for the evaluator as well in embedded environments. So the evaluator could be the subject, Murat, of the sentence, or the speaker.
Very cool. Thank you. We have a question in the Q&A, which I'll read out. How frequently do you see these types of constructions in Turkish and Bulgarian? And is there a domain like, for instance, are they not seen in writing or some kind of dialect restriction?
Yeah, so I can mostly speak about Turkish, but this is certainly a very colloquial register, and you would it would definitely not be seen in formal registers. The reason we saw that one example with the three mishes, it's like this kind of mixed style that mixes formal and very informal elements, and it's a special writing style. It's the reason we could sort of like see it in writing. But yeah, so it's very colloquial. And I mean, I did not do any study on how frequent it is, but it's not that frequent. Yeah.
Okay, and then we also have a request for a way to get a copy of the handout.
Yeah, can I put a link to the chat? I forgot.
Yeah, I think
I'll do that after the talk.
Are there any other questions? All right, well then thank you so much.
Thank you.
For that really interesting talk. And we'll move on to our next speaker. And our next two speakers, we have Tom Roberts and Kelsey Sasaki both from the University of California, Santa Cruz. And they will be presenting a talk on which predicates embed exclamatives and why. I guess I should have read that with question intonation, but so we, again, we'll have 20 minutes to present and 10 minutes for questions. And feel free to start.
Thank you. So exclamative sentences, like how tall you are typically thought to be a distinct sentence type, but they resemble other kinds of expressions in a bunch of ways. For instance, they resemble interrogatives in that they can contain an overt WH element as one does, or a subject-aux inversion as two does. They resemble degree expressions in that they often contain a gradable predicate, and for instance, English WH exclamatives may only use those WH words that can range over degrees. And finally, they resemble facts in that they seem to presuppose a proposition. And these properties have motivated analyses which attempt to treat exclamatives as special cases of questions, predicates of degrees, or facts. And we can isolate the semantics of exclamatives from their conventional discourse effects by examining their behavior in embedded contexts. So factive predicates like no have been observed to embed WH exclamatives, as in Francine knows how very tall Maurice is. And this has often been attributed to the factivity of the exclamative clause, since exclamatives seem to be presuppositional. For instance, how very tall Maurice is seems to presuppose that Maurice is in fact very tall. And while factive predicates can uniformly embed exclamatives, certain non-factive predicates can also embed exclamatives, as we see in 5, for instance, in Rhoda guessed how extremely boring the party was. And what the matrix predicates in 5 have in common with factives is that they can take both declarative and interrogative complements. That is, they are responsive, to use the terminology of Lahiri. So today we'll propose the empirical generalization in 6, which to our knowledge is novel. It's that a predicate can take WH exclamative complements if and only if that predicate is WH responsive. That is, it can take declarative complements and WH interrogative complements. And we'll also argue that this generalization can be derived by 2 independently motivated theoretical assumptions. First, that exclamatives denote questions, presupposing a particular answer, following Zanutini and Porter's analysis. And second, that responsive predicates S select for questions. So for some data, first we want to establish that embedded exclamatives truly are exclamatives, because some have argued that what appear to be embedded exclamatives are really embedded interrogatives in disguise, and true embedded exclamatives are actually ungrammatical. And one reason for that is that many WH exclamatives in embedded contexts are syntactically indistinguishable from interrogatives because they lack subject-docs inversion. But as Huddleston and others have argued against this view, embedded how adjective clauses are actually ambiguous between interrogative and exclamative readings, as in 7, and actually more helpfully for us today, what in X and how plus intensifier clauses lack clear interrogative readings, as we can see in 8. What a big nose do you have? This is bad as a question, but things like this are nonetheless embeddable, as you can see in 9. And we'll also note that inversion exclamatives seem to just never be embeddable in English, as we can see in 9c. So for today, we'll only be considering cases with what an X or how very X complements. Now about the predicates that embed exclamatives. So previous authors observed that the ability to embed exclamatives is somehow linked to factivity. This is based on examples like those in 10, with all these factive predicates embedding exclamatives. And Grimshaw goes so far as to claim that non-factive predicates can't embed exclamatives at all. Using examples like those in 11, it's possible what a full bill is bad. So while it is true that all factive predicates can embed exclamatives, we think that this is masking a larger generalization. So verbs that embed only declaratives like those in 12, like think or believe, or only interrogatives as those in 13, do not embed exclamatives. We can see this by the badness of 12c and 13c. However, all verbs that permit both declarative and interrogative complements, that is, the responsive predicates, do allow embedded exclamatives. Now this includes all effective predicates like those in 14, as well as speech act verbs like say, as we can see in 15, and a handful of other verbs like guess, like we have in 16. And we will note that predicates that can embed polar interrogatives, but not WH interrogatives such as doubt, cannot embed exclamatives, despite being responsive, as we can see here in 17. So this brings us to the generalization in 18 again, which is that a predicate can take WH exclamative complements if and only if it is WH responsive, that is, it can take both declarative and WH interrogative complements. And we'll note that the reverse, that if a predicate is WH responsive, it can embed exclamatives, also seems to be true. And lastly, a little bit about what embedded exclamatives mean. So there's a judgment of exceptionality or some sort of surprise that exclamatives seem to convey, and that must be linked to some perspective holder. Now in root contexts, this has just got to be the speaker. But what about in embedded exclamatives, for which there may be multiple possible perspective holders? So in non-negated contexts, the judgment of exceptionality seems to be necessarily associated with the speaker, as well as the matrix attitude holder. So in 19a, we have an example where the speaker and the matrix attitude holder, who's Bryony, are in agreement about how very tall Horatio is, that Horatio is somehow exceptionally tall. And this is fine. But in 19b and c, when you try to divorce that judgment of exceptionality from either the speaker or Bryony, things become infelicitous. Now, when these predicates are negated, the judgment of exceptionality is still attributed to the speaker, but not the attitude holder. As we see in 20, if Bernadette is speaking and says, Henrietta doesn't know what a glorious flower garden you have, it must be the case that Bernadette, the speaker, believes the flower garden to be glorious, like quite glorious, but it's no longer necessary that Henrietta does. So it seems that in positive contexts, both the speaker and the attitude holder must be surprised about the content of the exclamative, but in negative contexts, only the former must. Okay, so to our proposal. So first, about the denotation of the exclamatives themselves. So our proposal is inspired by Zanotini and Portner's analysis, in which WH exclamatives are effectively factive questions. They propose that exclamatives contain a left peripheral WH operator and a left peripheral factive operator. And each of these occupies its own CP layer. This is schematized in 21b. And the associated exclamative force, that is the surprise, is derived from the resulting denotation by this pragmatic process called widening. So for a WH exclamative, widening means expanding the initial domain of quantification for the WH operator to contain at least one additional extreme proposition of the same form as the propositions in the original domain. We propose a single left periphery operator defined in 22, in which ans1 applied to a question returns the maximal true answer to that question. Now here as well, Q sub C denotes Q as evaluated in context C, and QC plus is the set denoted by Q in a widened context C plus, such that QC plus has the properties in these bullet points below. And what these basically say is that QC plus contains all the propositions in QC, as well as some additional propositions that entail all of the propositions in QC. So when this operator is applied to a question, it returns the set containing a maximal answer to a domain widened Q, and it presupposes such an answer to exist and be true. Now the presupposition here imposes the widening requirement that the maximal answer to QC plus, is not in QC, and this we're inspired by independent proposals about NPIs and adjectives. Now the surprisal associated with exclamatives arises pragmatically, as it does in Zanutini and Portner's account. So the maximal true answer to QC plus is outside the contextually restricted domain of Q in the conversational context C, but this answer's existence is nonetheless presupposed. And what that means is that the true answer to Q requires the domain of WH quantification to be outside the normal domain, given the restrictions of C. Sorry. So Tom is meant to give the rest of this, but he seems to be frozen.
Okay, so I will just say I'm having some really bad internet connectivity, so if I disappear, Kelsey can take over. So with this denotation of exclamatives in hand, we now want to understand why responsive predicates are the ones which can embed them. Responsive predicates have long been assumed to select for propositions, and when they take an interrogative complement, that's somehow type shifted to be the answer to that question. We're going to follow recent work which assumes that responsive predicates underlyingly as select for questions instead. So the way this will work formally is that a responsive predicate like say will select for a question, which is to say a set of propositions, and contribute existential quantification over those propositions as in 23 for say, for instance. So say simply says there is a proposition in whatever argument Q such that the subject of say said that proposition. So under this view, say composes with interrogatives very straightforwardly because interrogatives denote questions. But say can also compose with declaratives, which are type shifted into singleton questions following Uegaki using the operator ID, which takes a proposition and returns the set containing just that proposition. And crucially, we assume that there is a unified denotation for declarative and interrogative embedding uses of the same predicate. So putting all of these ingredients together, we can derive the meaning of embedded WH exclamatives. So in 25, the sentence Dolly said how very tall Winifred is with an embedded exclamative has the LF in 25b, where the exclamative operator is applying to a question denotation of something like how tall is Winifred. So assuming that the context, the discourse context in which 25A is uttered provides that the range of plausible heights for Winifred is 5'9" to 5'11", the meaning of how very tall Winifred is, just the question components underneath the exclamative, we'll have the denotation in 26a, consisting of the propositions that Winifred is 5'9", 5'10", and 5'11". Now, in order for 25a to be felicitously uttered, Winifred's true height must somehow exceed 5'11" to fulfill the requirements of the widened context. So if her true height is in fact 6'1", QC plus must therefore contain the proposition that Winifred is 6'1". So this would look like in 27, where now in the widened context, the set denoted by how very tall Winifred is contains everything it did before, plus a couple of additional propositions where she's taller than 5'11". Okay, so putting all these pieces together, when we apply the exclamative operator to the question of how tall Winifred is, we get the resultant meaning in 28a, where we presuppose that there's a proposition, which is that Winifred is 6'1". That proposition is not in the normal discourse context set for the question of how tall Winifred is, but it's nevertheless true that Winifred is 6'1" in the world of utterance. And the asserted content is simply the set, only the proposition Winifred is 6'1". When we put this under the verb say, the presupposition remains just as it is, but say contributes existential quantification over propositions in the set containing just one proposition, that Winifred is 6'1". So what this amounts to at the end of the day is what we have in the final line of 28b. Again, the presupposition remains the same, but the asserted content is that Dolly said that Winifred is 6'1". So when all said and done, we have a claim that Dolly said that Winifred is 6'1", and a presupposition that Winifred is indeed 6'1", and that this height is somehow outside the normal range of heights in the discourse context. Okay, but if exclamatives are questions, we also would like an explanation why it's only responsive predicates that can embed them and not all question embedding predicates. So for instance, as we've seen, predicates like wonder and ask can't take exclamatives. And we propose, following Uegaki and Tyler et al., that the badness of 29 can be attributed to an interaction between the lexical semantics of such predicates and the meaning of exclamatives. So Uegaki proposes that interrogative only embedders like wonder presuppose that the attitude holder believes that both true and false answers to the embedded interrogative are possible, which is to say that the question is somehow non-trivial or unsettled as far as the attitude holder's beliefs are concerned. So this is given in 30 formally. And if we assume that the embedded presuppositions of an exclamative must be satisfied by the beliefs of the attitude holder, 30 correctly predicts that wonder plus an exclamative will be bad, precisely because embedded exclamatives denotes singleton questions. So there's no way for there to be both a true and a false proposition in that set, since there's only one proposition to choose from. So therefore, the presupposition of wonder would be impossible to satisfy with an embedded exclamative. Okay. Very quickly in the remaining time, we're going to consider three kind of classes of alternative semantic treatments of exclamatives. And we're going to suggest that they don't easily derive the embedded exclamative generalization in the way that a question semantics for exclamatives does. So a very broad category of exclamative treatments uses some kind of illocutionary force operator to derive their meaning, which of course is focused on root contexts. And a big problem for this is we expect exclamatives not to be embeddable. So it's a bit of a non-starter for our view that exclamatives are indeed embeddable. One such account is that of Jessica Rett, who additionally fundamentally treats exclamatives as properties of degrees with this exclamative force component. So we're abstracting away from that piece of her analysis, But her treatment of WH exclamatives as involving properties of degrees is very appealing on its face, because exclamatives seem to have this degree-related meaning across the board. They tend to be evaluative. And I should say in example 2, this is an observation restricted to English, but in English, only WH words with degree readings available can occur in WH exclamatives. So in 32, we see that there are what and how exclamatives, what and how being able to range over degrees, but there are no corresponding who, where, when, or why exclamatives. So again, if we put the illocutionary force component aside, we could imagine some version of Rhett's analysis whereby predicates are, exclamatives, excuse me, are fundamentally properties of degrees. This, we believe, is perhaps difficult to reconcile with our facts for at least 3 reasons. The first is that clausal embedding predicates don't embed other predicates of degrees more generally. So things like very, for instance, don't show up as complements of attitudes. And second, as Rhett herself notes, the degree property analysis doesn't straightforwardly account for inversion exclamatives that lack anything overly gradable. We should say, however, that it's also not the case that our account necessarily easily extends to those cases as well. But perhaps more compellingly, the observation in 32 for English that only what and how exclamatives are possible is not universal. So there's plenty of non-English languages which involve non-degreed WH phrases. So Dutch and Turkish are two such languages. It could be the case that examples like 33 and 34 do turn out to have degree interpretations after all, but we would need some additional story for how those readings arise. And again, that might be something we want more generally, and we're happy to listen to ideas about how to get degree interpretations of things that don't transparently have degrees. And finally, the final alternative we want to consider is the view of Castroviejo-Miro in her dissertation that exclamatives denote facts, which are taken to be ontologically distinct from propositions and questions in the sense of Ginsburg and Sog. So, glossing over some of the details, this is intuitively appealing because exclamatives seem to be factive, so it's quite reasonable to think maybe they denote facts. And in Ginsburg and Sog's view, there's this many-to-many mapping of clause types to semantic objects, whereby exclamatives always denote facts, and declaratives sometimes denote facts, and interrogatives also sometimes denote facts. So because exclamatives are fact denoting, we get the embedded exclamative generalization because any predicate which takes exclamatives can embed facts. So it should in principle allow for facts of any kind, whether they be exclamative, declarative, or interrogative. So this does derive the embedded exclamative generalization, but it doesn't derive, we think, that all responsive verbs are exclamative embedding. But perhaps more troublingly, we're not sure that we want to necessarily treat exclamatives as facts simply because we don't want to allow for non-factive predicates to select for facts per se. So for instance, predicates like guess or state or say can be modified with anti-factive adverbs when they take a declarative clause. So you would think that if they take facts, that something like 35, Umberto incorrectly guessed that the money was in safe number 72, should be disallowed. Now, this could be reconciled by allowing predicates like guess to take propositions or facts, as Ginsburg and Sog do, but it's not clear what additional empirical or theoretical coverage this would offer above our accounts, which makes fewer stipulations about the ontology of sentences. Okay, so wrapping up, we've claimed that WH exclamatives are indeed truly embeddable. And moreover, they're embeddable under exactly those predicates which are WH responsive, that can take both declarative and interrogative clauses. On the theoretical side, we've claimed that this empirical generalization can be derived by making two assumptions which are independently motivated, namely that exclamatives denote a kind of factive question, as in Zannettini and Portner, and moreover, that responsive predicates select for questions as opposed to propositions. There's many, many open questions here, such as whether we could derive the unembeddability of inversion exclamatives, whether the responsive generalization holds cross-linguistically, and if not, what the locus of variation is. And finally, maybe how to marry our proposal with some of the benefits from a degree analysis. So thank you very much.
All right, this was excellent. We have 10 minutes for questions, which can be either put in the chat or in the Q&A feature, or you can raise your hand and indicate that you have a question. While we're waiting on questions, I had one very early on, which is trivial, but could you go back maybe to your second example? I should have written down what the number was. Sorry. You had an example with find out very early on, and I had a little concern that was factive and that might be interfering with the judgments there.
Sorry, I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, I should have written down the number. I'm sorry. This found out 14. Oh, you are listening. No, it wasn't here. I'm sorry. Actually, this brings up a point in the chat, which is that people would like your handout. Yep. And maybe if I had looked in the handout, I would know the number of the question that I was asking about. But it looks like you're taking that into consideration in the in your judgments, so I doubt it's an issue. Okay, so we have a raised hand from Daniel. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Tom. Hi, Kelsey. Thanks for the nice talk. I'm sorry, I was a couple minutes late, so I missed the very beginning. But I guess it's partially question, partially just data point. I wanted to share this example. I think it's an old Lakoff example, and I was actually trying to find the paper. I'm not sure that I found it. But anyways, the example is something like, let's go outside because isn't it a beautiful day? Where isn't it a beautiful day, I think, is a negative inversion exclamative with the following intonation embedded under because. Yeah, I just wanted to share the data point. I don't know if you immediately have any thoughts about that off the top of your head. I think the observation that he makes is that you cannot put the because clause first. So because isn't it a beautiful day, let's go outside is clearly unacceptable. Whereas let's go outside because isn't it a beautiful day? So anyways, just wanted to sort of get that data point off my chest. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's an interesting case. I guess I want to probe a little more to make sure that that's indeed an exclamative as opposed to an interrogative with some kind of funny intonation. I don't know if you had a thought about that.
Well, the one thought that I have immediately is, you know, with these negative inversion exclamatives, like when they're not embedded, The difference between that and say like a high negation question with, you know, the bias that they convey. High negation questions typically have rising intonation, whereas the inversion exclamatives have falling intonation. So isn't it a beautiful day? Or don't you like cheese? Versus isn't it a beautiful day? And then the other difference is that with the exclamatives, they need some kind of gradable predicate. So like you can't say like you can say, isn't that a beautiful baby? But you cannot say, isn't that a baby? Right? And I assume that you will find the same thing with these because clauses, but I haven't done any real legwork here.
Yeah, that's interesting. We'll think about that. Thanks.
I found my quibble, which was with 19. B, which is marked infelicitous. I kind of think the factivity of found out is going to make this infelicitous regardless. So it might be better to show that contrast with a different verb.
Yeah, that's a fair point. We think that this same is true of speech act verbs, although with speech act verbs, there's this different confound, which we put in a footnote, where you can get this like de dicto reading. So yeah, it's a fair point. You know, there's sort of a confound no matter what predicate you use, I think.
Yeah. Okay, we have another raised hand. Joshua, if you want to ask your question. So it looks like we got a question from Joshua Martin. Mike. All right, you should be able to talk now.
Hello, can you hear me now? Great, so this is very interesting. I had a question actually about right where we are, about the interaction between the pattern in 20 and your eventual semantics. So if the semantics encodes the belief that there's a specific maximal true answer as a presupposition, why do we not expect that, or why wouldn't that presupposition project out of negation in contexts like 20 such that the attitude holder should still be expected to believe that in this instance the flower garden is glorious?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's maybe a more general like observation that when you have a presupposition in affective complement and you negate the factive predicates, that the presupposition doesn't always seem to have to hold for the attitude holder. So John, you know, Henrietta doesn't know where my dog is. Doesn't, I think, require that Henrietta knows that I have a dog. So it's an important point, and Kelsey might want to add something to this, but I think it's maybe a more general puzzle that we haven't quite solved.
Nope, Tom got it.
Okay, I suppose my my intuition about, which may just be incorrect, about the difference between those contexts is that I understood the presupposition in this instance to be a little bit more about speaker-oriented belief than perhaps the presupposition from something like my is, but that might be not a correct reading of what your semantics is meant to be doing.
Yeah, I think our semantics is like a little bit underspecified with respect to this question, we very much did not hard code the kind of judge parameter or something like that into the presupposition, precisely because there seems to be this kind of flexibility, or like maybe, you know, the speaker and the subject both have to be committed to something, and it seems to be a function of pragmatics and of the kind of verb that you have. But it is kind of snuck in there all the same by the fact that you have to compute what QC plus is. So I think, yeah, I think there's more to be done there.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
Thank
I think
you.
you're pressing on exactly the right thing, or like exactly the thing that we have to think about very seriously next. It was just more than we could really consider deeply in this talk, unfortunately, but thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. That's all the time we have for questions. Our next talk and final talk will be by Esther Ronai from the University of Chicago, presenting co-authored work with Ming Xiang, also from University of Chicago. And we'll be hearing about exploring the connection between question under discussion and scalar diversity.
Thank you very much. I'm putting the link to the slides in the chat just in case people are interested. Great, so thank you again. And I want us to start off from the well-known observation that in natural language conversation and communication, comprehenders regularly draw inferences that go beyond the literal meaning of an utterance or a sentence. And a very well-known case study of this is scalar inference, for instance, the sum but not all inference. And a more recent robust empirical finding is the one of the so-called scalar diversity. That is the finding that the likelihood of drawing a scalar inference, in fact, varies dramatically across lexical scales or Hort scales. And in this talk and in this project, we explored the role of the question under discussion, or QUD for short, in explaining this variation across rates at which the scalar inference is drawn. To give a brief summary of our findings, we will show that QUDs affect the rate of inference calculation from a large number of different scales. And additionally, we will show that question availability, which will be defined, predicts scalar diversity. That is, it predicts variation in inference rates, but only for unbounded scales. So first, I will offer some more background on scalar inference and then on scalar diversity. And then I will show you the results of three experiments. The first will be replication of the known scalar diversity effect. And the second one will be a QUD manipulation via manipulating over questions. And in the third experiment, we will explore whether question availability predicts scalar diversity from the first experiment. So the sentence in one, Mary ate some of the cookies, gives rise to the scalar inference that Mary ate some, but not all of the cookies. And similarly, in two, the sentence, the student is intelligent, gives rise to the scalar inference that the student is intelligent, but not brilliant. So in both of these cases, we can assume that the inference arises because comprehenders reason about an alternative that was available to the speaker, a stronger alternative that the speaker could have said, but because the speaker did not say this stronger alternative, its negation can be inferred. So in the first example, it would be Mary ate all of the cookies, and in the second example, it would be the student is brilliant. And as I said, it was relatively recently found that there is in fact considerable variation across different scales in the rates at which these scalar inferences are calculated. So for instance, the sum but not all scalar inference has been found to rise much more robustly than the intelligent but not brilliant inference. And just to give you a sense of the scope of this phenomena, experiments have been conducted on roughly 40-something different scales, and they found that, in fact, all of these scales differ dramatically from each other in the rate at which they give rise to SIs. So given this, the research question becomes, can we explain this variation in SI rates? Can we explain scalar diversity? And in particular, can we identify some properties of scales that predict and explain this variation? So existing work has indeed identified some such factors or properties of scales. For instance, Ventil et al. Have found that the distinctness of the stronger scalar term contributes significantly to scalar diversity. And they define the distinctness of the stronger scalar term as, first of all, semantic distance. So the finding is that the more distant a weak and the strong scalar terms are, the stronger the SI is from the weaker term. So to give you a sense of how this intuitively follows based on this one scale, in 3, we have 3 members of the same scale, many, most, and all. And the observation is that from 3A, many of the senators voted against the bill. The SI that is more likely to be derived will be the negation of 3C. So you are more likely to derive the inference, not all of the senators voted against the bill, than to derive the SI from the intermediate scalar term most. And that's because many and all are more distant than many and most. The other way in which distinctness of the stronger scalar term is operationalized is via boundedness. In particular, bounded scales, that is the scales where the stronger scalar refers to an endpoint, are found to lead to higher rates of scalar inference calculation. And I will return to boundedness in the second half of the talk. And there are a number of other known factors that existing work has identified that predict scalar diversity to some extent, for instance, local enrichability, or extremeness, or polarity. But what is important for us today is that even though some such factors have been identified, there is still a lot of variance, a lot of variation unaccounted for in the empirical results. Or in other words, a lot of scalar diversity is still unexplained. So at the same time, it is known that context plays an important role in scalar inference derivation. So in particular, QUDs have been found to have an effect. For instance, consider the dialogue in 4. Did Mary eat all of the cookies? The response is Mary ate some of the cookies. And now compare this to the dialogue in 5. Did Mary eat any of the cookies, or did Mary eat some of the cookies? And then once again, the response is Mary ate some of the cookies. But as has been found in a number of experiments, the dialogue in 4, or the sum containing sentence in 4, in fact produces a much higher rate of SI derivation than the one in 5. So existing work has largely concentrated on the sum all scale, but the finding from this is that QUDs, as operationalized, for instance, but not exclusively as overt questions in a dialogue, impact the rate at which SIs are drawn. However, in previous work on scalar diversity specifically, stimulus sentences, that is the sentences from which we're interested in whether an SI arises, were presented in the absence of any context. So this raises the question, might there be variation across scalar terms in what kind of QUD they most naturally bring to mind? And based on this, we're hypothesizing that scalar diversity, in the absence of an explicit question under discussion, arises at least partially due to the differential availability of a polar question that contains the stronger scalar term from the scale. So to unpack this a bit, this is basically the intuition that the more likely a comprehender is to entertain a question such as, is the student brilliant? The more likely they will be to derive a scalar inference from the sentence, she is intelligent. So the more available, or the more likely, or the more common a question such as, is the student brilliant, is, the higher the rate of SI calculation from the corresponding statement, the student is intelligent. So this is the hypothesis that we explore in 3 experiments. As I mentioned before, first we're going to replicate the basic scalar diversity finding, and then we're going to conduct QUD manipulation by manipulating over questions in a dialogue. And finally, in our third experiment, we're going to operationalize question availability and explore whether it indeed predicts scalar diversity. So to start us off, as I said, our first experiment was a replication of scalar diversity, and in particular, we replicated Ventil et al.'s original experiment. So this was a web-based experiment with native speakers of American English. And in particular, this experiment employed an inference task with the aim of investigating the likelihood of deriving an SI from 43 different scales. These scales were taken from Ventil et al. And contained adjectival scales, verbal scales, quantifier scales, etc. So this image shows you an example of a trial that an experimental participant would have seen. So participants were presented with a sentence uttered by this person, Mary. For instance, "Success is possible," says Mary. And then the participants were asked the following: would you conclude from this that according to Mary, success is not certain? So this is getting at the possible certain scale. And participants had to respond with a yes or no answer. And importantly, in this task, a yes response suggests that the participant has calculated the scalar inference. So if you think that, or if you answer that you would conclude from "success is possible" that success is not certain, that suggests that you calculated the possible but not certain scalar inference. And on the other hand, if you respond no, that suggests that you have not calculated the scalar inference. So this is basically a replication of Ventil et al.'s experiment. So let's see our results. These are the results. On the x-axis, I'm showing you the percent of scalar inference calculated across all participants. And on the y-axis, we can see the 43 different scales. So as is very visually salient, we successfully replicated the scalar diversity effect. So observe that there is robust variation across the different scales in the percentage at which they led to an SI calculation. So it ranges from the intelligent brilliant and the ugly hideous scale, which in this experiment did not lead to SI calculation at all, to, on the other hand, the sum all scale or the difficult impossible scale, which led to SI calculation quite robustly. So having replicated the scalar diversity effect, let us now turn to a QUD manipulation. So in our second experiment, we are investigating whether overt questions have an effect on the SI rate for all these different scales. So once again, we conducted a web-based experiment with native speakers of American English. And the basic inference task was identical to the one in experiment 1 that I just walked you through. But importantly, we also included a two-condition question manipulation here. So the statement that contains a weak scalar term that Mary utters was now embedded in a dialogue context. And specifically, there were two different conditions. So Mary's statement was either preceded by a question that contained the stronger scalar, for instance, is the solution perfect? Or it was preceded by a question that contained the weaker scalar, for instance, is the solution good? So once again, this image shows you an example of a trial that an experimental participant would have seen. So you can see that now participants are presented with a dialogue. Sue asks, is the solution perfect? And Mary answers, it is good. So this is a case of the strong condition, the strong question condition from the question manipulation. And then the task is the same. Would you conclude that the solution is not perfect according to Mary? And as in the case of experiment 1, if someone answers yes, that suggests that they have calculated the SI, and if someone answers no, that suggests that they have not calculated the SI. So these are the results. Once again, this is a very similar plot to the one of experiment 1. So on the x-axis, we have the percent of SI calculation. So how many of our experimental participants, or what percentage of our experimental participants actually calculated the SI from that scale. And on the y-axis, we have the 43 different scales that we investigated. And importantly, the colors denote the question manipulation. So for each scale, the black bar represents the condition where Mary's statement was preceded by a strong question, so a question that contained the stronger scalar from the scale. And the yellow bar denotes the condition where Mary's statement was preceded by the weak question. So what we can see is that across the board, for almost all of the 43 scales, there were more scalar inferences derived when the preceding question contained the stronger scalar term. So for the vast majority of the scales, you can see that the black bar is higher than the yellow bar. And indeed, this is borne out in the statistical analysis. We find a significant effect of question in experiment 2. So in other words, we can conclude from our experiment 2 that an explicit QUD and overt question is found to influence scalar inference rates for a large number of different lexical scales. And now let us turn to our third and final experiment, in which we explore question availability. So as before, this experiment was done online on the web with native speakers of American English. And our third experiment employed a forced choice task. So in particular, participants had to choose which of two polar questions, the one that contains the stronger versus the one that contains the weaker scalar term, they would be more likely to ask. So this image is again an example of a trial that was presented to participants in the experiment. You can see that the instructions were as follows. Compare the following two questions about a girl. Which one are you more likely to ask? And then participants could either click on, is the girl beautiful or is the girl pretty? In this case, investigating the pretty beautiful scale. And so our prediction here for the third experiment is that these the results of this forced choice task, which is what I have been referring to as question availability, should predict scalar diversity from the first experiment. So more specifically, our prediction following from our hypothesis is that the more preferred the stronger question is in experiment 3, the higher the SI rate should be in experiment 1. And now let's turn to our results. So on this plot, I'm showing you once again all the 43 different scales, but this time on the x-axis, we have the results of experiment 3. So the percent of choosing the strong question in the forced choice question availability task. So once again, this ranges from 0% to 100% and measures what percentage of our participants said that they would be more likely to ask the stronger question and not the weaker question. And on the y-axis this time, we have the results of our experiment 1. So the y-axis shows you the percent of SI calculation, the basic scalar diversity effect. And based on this, what we see is that contra our predictions, question availability was not found to be an overall predictor of SI rates. So it is not the case that simply the more likely you are to ask a QUD or entertain a QUD about the stronger term, the more likely you are to derive an SI from the weaker term. However, our findings will change slightly once we take into account boundedness. So as I already mentioned, bounded scales can be defined as the ones where the stronger scalar denotes an endpoint. So for instance, because all denotes an endpoint or a fixed point, we can say that the sum all scale is bounded. And this contrasts with unbounded scales, where both the weaker and the stronger scalar term denotes an interval. So for instance, because brilliant does not denote an endpoint, it denotes an interval, we say that the intelligent brilliant scale is unbounded. And now let's return to our results, but this time split the scales based on boundedness. So as before, on the x-axis, we have the percent of choosing the strong question from experiment 3. And on the y-axis, we have the percent of SI calculation from the weaker term from experiment 1. But this time, the colors represent whether a scale can be classified as bounded or unbounded. And the red scales are the bounded ones, and the blue scales are the unbounded ones. And so first of all, we find that bounded scales led to significantly higher rates of SI calculation than unbounded rates, which is a finding from Ventil et al., which we here successfully replicated. But even more importantly, we find a significant interaction of question availability with boundedness. So as you can see on this plot, we see that there is a trend of question availability predicting SI rates for the unbounded scales only, so for the blue half of the scales. So let's unpack this interaction a bit more. So as I said, we find a significant interaction of question availability and boundedness. And in particular, we find that unbounded scales do show a strong trend whereby question availability predicts SI calculation. So for unbounded scales, we find that the more likely participants were to choose the strong question, for instance, is the student brilliant, the higher the rate of calculating the relevant SI, not brilliant from intelligent. But for bounded scales, we find no effect of question availability. So one tentative explanation of what might be going on here is as follows. As I said before, in bounded scales, the stronger scalar term is not vague. Instead, it denotes a fixed point or an endpoint. So based on this, we might argue that the stronger term is independently very salient as an alternative to the vague, weaker term. And this produces high rates of SI calculation in bounded scales, and the QUD makes no difference here. On the other hand, in unbounded scales, both of the scalar terms are vague. So both of them denote intervals whose values vary according to the context. And because of this, we might argue that the salience of the stronger alternative is subject to contextual support. So basically, the more available a QUD based on the stronger term is, the more likely hearers will be to reason about that term as the stronger alternative. And therefore, they will be more likely to derive the SI. So of course, there is a number of open questions that we're exploring in ongoing and future work. So one type of open question that we're still exploring is coming up with a different kind of QUD manipulation for our experiment 2. In particular, attempting to set up these biasing contexts without using overt questions that explicitly mention the scalar terms. Because as things stand, the findings of our experiment 2 could be explained as being relevance implicatures and not scalar implicatures. So one might argue that if I ask, is the student brilliant, and you answer, she's intelligent, then I'm driving an implicature even if the two terms are not on the same lexical scale. And we're also exploring whether we might find a better empirical measure of question availability than the forced choice test that we used in experiment 3. So we're interested in, how likely someone is to entertain a QUD about the stronger scalar term, and there might be better ways of getting at that experimentally. And of course, which question a speaker is more likely to choose, or how likely they are to entertain the QUD that is based on the stronger term, may itself be a context-dependent notion. But despite these open questions, what we can conclude from today's findings is that QUDs robustly affect SI calculation rates for a large number of different scales. In particular, we showed you that questions that are based on the stronger of two scalar terms lead to higher SI rates. And additionally, we showed you that the likelihood of a question that is based on the stronger scalar term contributes to scalar diversity, but specifically only for unbounded scales. Thank you.
Thank you for that very interesting talk. We have about 7 minutes for questions, and we already have a raised hand. So let me give the power of speech. There we go.
Hi, Esther. Andrea Vildama from University of Pennsylvania. Great talk, as always. I was thinking, to what extent, what your thoughts are about the role that the semantics of this kind of extreme unbounded adjectives play in all this process. I mean, I know we already talked about this before, but something I keep thinking about is, on the one analysis that we have of these guys, which is basically Morzicki's theory, what is interesting is that in his theory, this kind of heightened context sensitivity of these adjectives is kind of nicely predicted by the fact that he claims that the standard for something like brilliant or terrific or awful, each of those adjectives you had, it's kind of by definition already beyond contextual salience. It's part of a portion of a scale that we're not willing to consider anyway, unless we really want to get there. So I was wondering if, so in a sense, this seems to be tying nicely with your results. It could be an extra factor that could play into that. And so maybe my question is, do you think the distinction between boundedness and unboundedness is just, you know, to what extent do you think it's tied to this particular semantics? Are these just two faces of the same phenomenon? Do you think these are just two distinct things, and, you know, what you really want to go for is boundedness as opposed to the other thing? Just, you know, what are your thoughts on this particular issue?
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, so definitely I would say that I agree with what you said, that the semantic analyses of extreme adjectives also makes the same prediction. I guess I have two responses to that. The first one is that I think that boundedness, to the extent that it can be neatly defined and applied to different scales, should apply to non-adjectival scales as well. So I think that in future work, one way to see if extremeness and boundedness are roughly the same notion for our purposes, or if they can be teased apart, and if so, which one is the right one. Maybe we could analyze and focus more on non-adjectival scales. So in ongoing work, I'm expanding these findings to a larger scale set that is less heavily biased towards adjectives. So I think that should be interesting to see if that might lead us to believe that it is boundedness and not extremeness. And I guess less interestingly, I think that I will have to build into the statistics both coding for extremeness and coding for boundedness. And I guess then we will see statistically if boundedness as such makes an effect in predicting the variation above and beyond extremeness, or if, as you say, which, you know, I'm completely happy with, if it is after all extremeness that we should be talking about and not boundedness.
Thanks.
We have another, so we have another raised hand. Daniel, if you want to ask your question.
Hi, Esther. Thanks for the great talk. That was very interesting. I just had a thought about one of the points you ended on about experiment 3 and looking for other ways to measure QUD availability. I was thinking about these old experiments from the 70s that are like about lexical access, where you like hear a word like bugs in a sentence, and then you're pushing a button as quickly as possible if you know, when you see a word that you think is related, and you know, they're testing like spy versus insect, and then right. So like, I wonder if there's some way to use something like that to figure out how quickly people are thinking about the stronger alternatives when they hear the weaker alternative.
Yeah, so in fact, thank you very much for relating these findings to those findings. We do in fact have ongoing work that utilizes semantic priming, and we are indeed very interested in seeing whether, you know, if when you're deriving a scalar inference such as some but not all, whether upon encountering the scalar term some, you are activating psycholinguistically speaking, the stronger alternative all. And we are trying to get at using semantic priming, which I believe is like a lexical decision task after semantic priming, which I believe is what the experiment that you reference is also utilized. So hopefully we will have some answer to that in the future. I'm not entirely sure if what we are doing at the moment would get at the same thing as our current experiment 3, but I think that down the line that should also, I think it's an open question whether this kind of question availability or how likely you are to entertain a QUD is about the salience and the availability and the activation of the stronger scalar alternative per se, or if there is something about the discourse structuring role of the QUD more generally, irrespective of or on top of the activation of the stronger scalar as a lexical item and along the lines of lexical access, as you say.
That's really interesting. Thanks. I look forward to hearing what you all find.
Thank you.
All right, and then we have a question from the Q&A from Garima Chopra. the question is, thank you so much for the presentation. This was very interesting. I was actually wondering about varying the assessment question from a forced decision task, which you already addressed in your open questions. I was thinking if you opt for a rating scale with a question such as, how likely is Mary to think X is certain, would you possibly see considerable and or similar variation in responses, both for bounded and unbounded scales?
Yes, thank you. So so I guess this is not a re-operationalization of our current experiment question availability measure. I guess this is just the basic inference task, whether if we change the, do you think that according to Mary, etc., instead of giving a yes or no binary option, we give them a rating scale. We haven't done this, but I believe that some other work has used a rating scale and found that that the results are roughly in line if you use a rating scale or if you use a forced choice to alternative binary task. But maybe we should explore a more Likert scale-like task for experiment 3, which perhaps is what this question asker is asking. So thank you.
Okay, and then there's another question in the Q&A from Glenn Starr. Very interesting talk, thank you. Have you ever considered individual variability in the noticing of input in the context or QUD? That is, might certain cognitive aptitudes, such as pragmatic reasoning ability, contribute to their implicature derivation behavior? This is what Yang et al., for example, concluded.
Yeah, so certainly I have, I guess, yes, I have considered it more in the abstract. Thank you for pointing this out. I should do more to unpack my own existing and future data in light of individual variability, because yes, I think this is right, that individuals are known to vary even in the most basic scalar inference derivation tasks. Usually, as far as I know, people fall into 3 categories. They either always derive a scalar inference, or they never do, or they vary from trial to trial. So it should be interesting to explore whether a similar kind of individual variation would come into play when it comes to, do individuals rely on context or take into account the QUD, and how I guess the 2 kinds of individual variations might interact. Thank you. I'll look more at my own data.
Great. That's all the time we have for questions, but thank you to all of our speakers. Those were 3 very interesting talks, and if people have additional questions, hopefully they can find a time to chat offline. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Closing the session now.